home insurance companies really like owner occupants. We tend to be a very good risk insurability perspective. Tenants, less so. And so because of that fact, your home insurance coverage is going to change, as is your rate and the premium that you're paying, and it's likely going to go up. Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of The Remote Investor. I'm Michael Albom, and today I'm joined by my co-host,
Pierre.
And today we're going to be tackling maybe not an age-old question, but I think a hot topic in today's day and age, and that's should you and how do you convert your primary residence into a rental property? So let's get into it.
All right, Mike, we got a question from a listener, and they wanted to know more about the process of turning your primary residence into a rental property. They heard you mention it in the last, previous episode, and they want to know all the details from the beginning to end. So, who does this even make sense for? Like, why should someone consider this?
Yeah, it's such a good question, and it's one that's very near and dear to my heart. And I just want to preface this whole conversation that if we hear a bunch of noises in the background, it's because I'm in the midst of a major remodel. So my apologies in advance.
Are you turning your primary into a rental?
It's a good question. No, not right now, but we will at some point. I know we will at some point. I hope my wife Claire isn't listening to this. I promise. Not for a long, long time. So this is something that I think should be considered by anybody who's moving out of their primary residence. And they could be moving out for any number of reasons, whether it's they're moving to a different house because they've outgrown their current house, they are moving for a job, they're moving just to relocate for the sake of relocating. Anyone who is leaving a property that they own, I think should at least consider converting it to a rental. Reason being, there's a multitude of them, and I think we'll have enough time in today's episode to tackle the high level ones. But from my opinion, one of the biggest reasons someone would do this is because now you are stepping into being a rental property owner without having to do a lot of the things that you have to do in order to become traditionally a rental property owner. So first and foremost, one of the biggest ones is when it comes to financing. So anybody out there who's bought a primary residence may have put 20% down, or they may have put a lesser amount down, 10, 15%, 5%. There are programs out there even as low as 3.5%. And if you're a veteran of the military or armed services, you might be using a VA loan in which you could have put 0% down. Now, I don't know if those type of loan products apply to investment properties. They tend to not. And so for investment properties, it tends to be a flat 20% down that you got to put in order to get into a property. So let's say you bought a property, Pierre. Let's take your house, for example. You bought it and maybe put, let's say, 5% down. You not only get to put a smaller down payment as compared to you buying the exact same house with your exact same buying profile, but if you were buying it for investment purposes, your down payment automatically jumps to 20%. Now, secondly, when you go to get a loan to do that, the lender is going to ask you, is this a primary residence or is this an investment property? If it's a primary residence, you're going to get a much more attractive interest rate as compared to, again, same house, you're the same buying profile, but for an investment purpose, you're going to be at least 1% higher when it comes to that loan. So you're getting in for a lower down payment amount and you're getting better financing. So you now own this house. Now, when you move out of it, now it's okay. So you've lived there, you buy the house, you live there. Most mortgages, most loans say that you got to live there for at least a year before you move out of it or do anything with it. So make sure that you're checking, and the listener who submitted the question is checking with their lender what their requirements are for their particular loan, because every lender could have a slightly different requirement. But generically speaking, 12 months is kind of that magic number. Okay, so you bought the thing for less down payment. You have a more attractive rate than if you bought it as an investment property. And so now you're going to consider moving out of it and converting it into a rental property. Well, the bank isn't going to come ask that additional 15% down. And they're not going to make you change your interest rate to now be that of a would-be investor. So you get to own and operate this property while you're living there as a primary residence and keep the same financing in place when you convert it to a rental. And so anyone who has a mortgage, and I think the contrast is so stark if somebody owns investment property and a primary residence. They can really see what the difference in process was and then the difference in ownership and operation of that is. So anyone who falls into that category will likely agree with me. The owner-occupant bucket is often a easier place to be.
So quickly, Mike, are you buying this primary residence with the intention of turning it into a rental property, or are we just talking about a benefit that happens to occur with, because most people I think would be moving out of their property and want to sell it. Are you looking at rentals, or are you looking at primary residence with the intention to turn them into a rental eventually?
Oh yeah. So my wife was kind of giving me a hard time when we bought our very first primary. I evaluated it up and down like it was going to be a rental because I knew at some point we would be moving out of it. And so I wanted that double dip factor to be able to say, okay, once we move out, whenever that is, let's convert it to a rental and have the numbers work. So I'm an engineer, I'm numbers focused, I'm numbers oriented, I'm an investor. And so that's something I'm always looking at. Not everybody is going to be in that situation because they're not going to be going into a new purchase. They maybe already own this property or inherited a property that they're living in and are now determining and thinking about, hey, does this even make sense for me to convert to a rental? Maybe the answer is no. And we're going to get into why that could be in just a little bit. But if you have the ability, if you're going through an acquisition process and you're like, yeah, I could see us living here, but also maybe moving out at some point, I think it's pertinent. Why not run the numbers as an investment property, see what that looks like, just so you know. It may turn out that it doesn't make sense at all as a rental, given the area and the expenses. And that's okay. There's nothing wrong with that, but at least you're now going into the decision armed with as much information as possible, as opposed to buying the house, living in it, and then going, I wonder, maybe we should convert it to a rental. Oh, shoot, by the way, it doesn't work. Now we got to make the decision going forward what to do with it. I like to have all the information or as much information as possible on the front end. And then you as the owner, you as the investor get to decide what makes the most sense for you and your family or those living in the property at that point in time. So okay. Financing is, I think, one of the biggest reasons why it makes sense to convert a primary residence to a rental property.
And nothing happens to your mortgage when you turn it into the rental. It's just deal stays the same.
Deal stays the same. You've got that mortgage. Well, okay, that's with kind of a caveat. You've got that mortgage as long as the mortgage is in place. And so if you've got an ARM or an adjustable rate mortgage or a mortgage that's only fixed for a certain amount of time, there is the possibility that it's going to adjust to whatever the prevailing interest rate is. Now, this is a great question for your lender if anybody falls into this category. If they have since moved out of the property and the rate is now adjusting, will the lender treat it as an investment property, or are they still going to consider it an owner occupant? This is, I think, kind of a really unique circumstance, one that I'm not familiar with. I've only used 30-year fixed mortgages for my primary residences. So if somebody listening out there has an ARM, I would absolutely recommend reaching out to your lender and asking that question, and then coming and telling us, because I would be super curious to know what that looks like. And we'll do some research too on our end. But so for those folks that have fixed mortgages, no, their lender is not going to require them to do anything. Nothing changes. You're going to continue making your payment, whatever that payment is monthly, for the life of that loan, even once you're moved out of the property.
So what are the insurance implications about doing this? I'm sure you have to change.
Yes, you do. And it's something that I think often gets overlooked because it's one of those little details, if you will, that it's just, if you haven't done this before, you would never know that, hey, this is something you need to change. So absolutely you have to change. Your policy is written for you as an owner occupant. Home insurance companies really like owner occupants. We tend to be a very good risk insurability perspective. Tenants, less so. And so because of that fact, your home insurance coverage is going to change, as is your rate and the premium that you're paying. And it's likely going to go up. Just like in the financing world, if you're getting the mortgage as an owner occupant or prime residence, your rate's going to be more attractive than if it's a rental property. Same thing with insurance. Rental property coverage is probably going to cost a little bit more. Now, there are some coverages that you're definitely going to want to be on the lookout for once you make that transition to it being a rental property. So first and foremost, the contents coverage is likely going to go down. Now, the contents is everything in a home that if we took the home, turned it upside down, would fall out of it. So your couches, your TVs, your beds, all the stuff that you as an owner bring into the house with you. That's your contents. So if you're not renting your house out furnished or your property out furnished, you're likely moving all of your contents with you to the new property. So there's not going to be a lot there. Now, there's still going to be maybe a fridge and a stove and some kitchen appliances and such. So we want to make sure we have some appliance coverage. But if you're, again, not renting it out furnished, you can remove that coverage or cut that coverage down significantly. The second coverage that you want to be on the lookout for is loss of use. Now, when you're living in the property and you have a covered claim, the loss of use is basically, Pierre, if you can't live in the house anymore, it's dollars that are going to be given to you to go fund you to live somewhere. So whether that's a hotel or renting a different house or a different property, these are dollars that you're going to be able to use to do that. Well, if you're not living in the house, the loss of use then turns into basically lost income if there's a covered claim in the house. So let's say there's a fire that's covered by the insurance policy, and the claim is, hey, the tenant can't live in this property for 12 months while there's repairs being made. Well, you as the owner still have your expenses to pay, but you're no longer collecting rent because the tenant isn't living there. This is a coverage for that. The insurance company will pay you the lost rent either up to a certain dollar amount or up to a certain time frame. And so every insurance company is a little bit different. You want to find out how they treat it. But loss of use is a really important coverage to make sure that you've got if you have a rental property. Above and beyond that is liability. If somebody comes and hurts themselves at your house while you're living there, you likely have a liability coverage on your insurance policy as a homeowner that will pick up any claim that somebody brings against you as a homeowner. Same thing with the tenant. If you've got an injury, either the tenant hurts themselves or somebody comes on to visit the tenant, visit your property and gets hurt and sues you, you have the same liability coverage would pick that up. I personally like to increase that coverage. I'm of the opinion I like $1 million minimum in terms of my liability, and then I go stack on umbrella coverage above and beyond that. But that's a very personal choice, and everybody's got to decide what makes the most sense for them, where they're going to insure up to, because you could be overinsured, you could be underinsured. It really all just comes down to your risk tolerance. But so those three things are big coverages that you want to be on the lookout for and make sure that you're adjusting appropriately when you make that conversion from primary to rental property. Great question.
And then you're requiring your tenants to have renter's insurance once they're in there.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. So renter's insurance, if anybody has been a renter, you may have had it. It might be the first time you hear about it, but it's basically an insurance policy for all your stuff that's in the property that you're renting, and additionally for loss of use. So if you go rent a property and the property has a fire and you can't live there anymore, well, the homeowner's insurance policy is going to pay the homeowner what you were paying them in rent because there's lost income for them, but you as the tenant need to protect yourself. And so there's a loss of use provision or dollar amount usually within a renter's insurance policy, which then is going to give the renter money to go find a new place to live. And additionally, it's going to cover all of the contents, the stuff, their beds, their couches, their TVs that they've now moved into the home. And renter's insurance is super cheap, like super, super cheap. So it's definitely something to encourage or demand. I require it in all of my rentals that renters have their own rental insurance coverage. So that way they're not coming looking to me if there's a loss of the property, like, hey, where's my stuff? Where's my coverage? No, that's on you as the tenant. I've got my own coverage for the property. You got to cover your stuff.
Just a detail question. Maybe you don't know about this, but if the renters have someone over and they get hurt, is it going to go straight to the homeowner's insurance, or is there some coverage that first hits the renters as being responsible before it comes onto your policy?
That's a good question, man. Renter's insurance, we usually have some kind of liability on it, but chances are homeowners getting named in any kind of lawsuit, like day one. Attorneys are going to name everybody they can in the lawsuit. So they might name the renter, they might name the homeowner, they might name the management company if there is one, and see who's got the deepest pockets. And so
and the most visible.
Yeah, finances. Or the most visible. Like,
yeah.
And I mean, I know we talk about like lawsuits and stuff, and I think it's often a scary thing because the numbers we hear about are so big in these lawsuits. At the end of the day, you have to remember, like, you have to be proven negligent, or someone has to prove that they have a case against you that you as an owner did something wrong, which contributed to this injury or to this loss. And so if you're playing by the rule book and crossing all your T's and dotting all your I's, you really shouldn't have a problem. But insurance is one of those things that it's nice to have, and it's there for when you need it.
Cool. I think that answers my insurance questions. What about like the utilities? Do you take care of that yourself, or do you make your renters take that on?
Yep. So another great question. It really varies, and I would say depending on the market that you're operating in. So me personally, I've done it both ways. I've put the utilities on the tenant and said, okay, 100%, these are your responsibilities now. However much you use, you're paying for it. It's for you. And so I switch the utilities over to their name, and they pay for it. I've also done it where I've included it in the rent and just said, hey, this is the price. And that works really well for short-term and midterm rentals. No Airbnb guest, nobody coming for a month off Furnish Finder is going to be willing to put the utilities in their name. It's just not a good fit. And so we wrap everything in. That's, of course, tough because pet tenants aren't paying attention to things they aren't paying for. And so they might be running the heat in the winter and leaving the windows open when it's 60 degrees outside. It's like, come on, but they're not paying for it, so it's not a big deal. Versus, hey, if they pay for it, doesn't really matter how much they use because they're paying for it. You're not on the hook for it. So that's my preference, is to put all the utilities in the tenants' names. Now, it's not always an option. So, like, for example, the short-term basis or the medium-term basis, if you're renting out your property on anything but long-term, you might need to keep the utilities in your name. And then for me, from our last primary that we moved out of, it was a duplex, but the utilities weren't split. There was only one gas meter, one electric meter, and one water meter. And so I can't say, oh, tenant A, you're responsible for this much, tenant B. So I wrapped in the utilities into the rent, and I said, okay, this is the rent. This is how much the utility bill back is. Utilities are staying in my name. So I'm paying for it. And it sucks. Like, they use a lot of power and they use a lot of water, and they're not as conscientious as I would be because I'm paying for it. But at the end of the day, it's okay. But in an ideal world, you would have all the utilities in the tenant's name. It's all math, right? So figuring out, okay, what's the base rent? What's a typical utility amount that they would be paying? And maybe you can juice that a little bit and say, okay, well, now because of the ease of use, you don't have to worry about utilities. I'll take care of it. You just pay one fixed monthly
like
rent
a service
amount.
charge.
Yeah, like, you don't have to deal with it. And some people don't mind paying for that convenience. Other people would say, no, I want to pay for it, or no, that rent amount is too high. Because for some people, like, the numbers scare them away. It says, oh, well, I could rent the house for $500. Why am I paying $900 at your house? It's like, well, you'd be paying an extra $500 in utilities, so you'd be out of pocket $1,000. You're actually getting a better deal here. Sometimes you need to break it down and make folks understand. And having an old utility bill, I think, is super helpful, which anybody who has a primary and is converting it to rental absolutely will. So you can tell people, hey, this is what an average utility bill looks like the year. We can either wrap it into the rent or you can pay it. That's another way to play it, right? Is give it to the tenants. But I personally, I much prefer to have tenants pay for it. I don't have to worry about it. I don't have to think about it. It's just easier. And then if there's any kind of service that has to be done, like it's in the tenant's name, it just makes it easier. So again, when that's an option, I would highly recommend putting everything on the tenant if possible.
Cool. I want to ask you about property management, because I know that when we look at primary residence, we tend to have a little bit more of an emotional attachment to them than, say, a remote property that we bought for the purpose of making it appeal to the broadest possible market.
Yeah.
Do you have like a greater sense of management to look over a property that you once lived in or that you might want to move back to one day?
Yeah, I do. I totally do. I don't think everybody does. I know people that have moved out of the rentals and just said, here, property manager, you take it over, you deal with it, send me my rent check. But I also know people that self-manage their old primaries, and that's what I do. So we've done this twice now. We moved out of primaries, converted to rental, and I self-manage it. And part of the reason is because I know the property so well. I know that water heater is kind of finicky. And so if there's an issue with it, you just go tap on it 3 times. That kind of stuff. You inherently know these properties. And so it I think personally makes it easier to self-manage as opposed to a manager coming in who I'm sure could do a good job if you do a great job screening them and making sure they're to work with you. Property managers can be great. But it's a property manager and they are not going to be treating the property like you would because it's yours. Nobody will. So I know who to call if there's a plumbing leak. I know who to call as a landscaper because I called these people to service it when I lived there. And so I already have a network of vendors. I don't need the property managers. And I don't find screening tenants and interviewing tenants and ultimately placing tenants to be very difficult, even from afar. And I think once you start to understand what you're willing to do and then also what you're capable of doing yourself as opposed to paying somebody else, maybe it makes sense to self-manage. Now, I will say that there becomes a point where it probably doesn't make sense. And I think everybody needs to decide that for themselves. And I think what's a big driver of that and what people should be thinking about is, what are they actually going to be paying a property manager versus what are they going to be, quote unquote, paying themselves or saving themselves if they go with that they self-manage. So let's take two examples here. One is $1,000 a month property. When you move out of it, let's say the market rents $1,000 for your house. A traditional leasing fee is going to be, let's call it 1 month's rent to make the math easy. And then let's say ongoing management is 10%. So you're going to pay somebody, if you go with a manager, $1,000 to get a tenant screened and ultimately placed in your property. And then ongoing dealing with that tenant, the manager is going to charge you $100 a month. Versus you doing it yourself, how long is that going to take you if it's your first time? How much time are you going to have to spend on an ongoing basis dealing with maintenance requests, talking to tenants, that sort of a thing? You're paying yourself $100 a month. And so if it's going to take you an hour a month, you think, because you've lived there, you know what kind of maintenance calls you've had to make over a given month or a given year or season. If you think, oh, it'll take me an hour a month, well, you're paying yourself $100 an hour. Maybe that's a great rate. Versus you think it'll probably spend close to 4 hours managing this stuff, doing all of the things associated with owning and operating a rental property. If you think that'll be closer to 4 hours a month, well, now you're paying yourself $25 an hour. Again, could be a great rate for you, or it might not be worth your time. And so I don't think we can necessarily say self-management is better for owner-occupant properties that are now converted to rentals because you know them better. There's this time element piece that I think is really important to consider. Now, conversely, we take an example B property that rents for $3,000. That's $3,000 you're saving by placing a tenant yourself, and $300 a month, so $3,600 a year for dealing with the tenant. And so if you're spending, again, that same 1 hour a month, that's $300 an hour. Or if you're spending 4 hours a month, that comes out to what, $75 an hour? So the numbers change fairly drastically, but the amount of time likely doesn't. And so
it could even be less on the higher end property too, because you might have a more reliable, solid tenant in there.
Yes, exactly the point I was going to make. So it's not a one size fits all. We can't really take a blanket approach with this. But the rentals that I own and operate that are self-managed, that are my primary residences, the price point is such that it makes sense for me to self-manage. I kind of enjoy it, truth be told. I'm kind of crazy and sick in the head like that. So I enjoy it. And I know the people, I know the tenants, just because I've interviewed them, I've screened them. So you can be very selective and very particular with how you manage your rental property as opposed to hiring a manager. You're going to be somewhat subject to the way that they manage and the way that they do things. So again, not right or wrong in either case, but you just want to be asking these questions of yourself and then ultimately of a property manager if you're going to be screening them and interviewing them. And I encourage people to do that. Like, go see what's available in your market. You might find a great fit, or you might find you're probably better off doing it yourself.
Have you noticed a pattern of vendors, like when you're hiring vendors as an owner occupant to come, say a landscaper or electrician or whatever, you have this local network of people that you've employed as an owner occupant. Do you find that when you hire these vendors through a property manager, I know that they typically upcharge, but do you save with those vendors given that you're kind of working on an economy of scale, or are they charging you more because they know that you're an investor and they can get more out of you?
Good question. I don't think I felt price gouged with folks because of the fact that I was an investor. But what I can tell you is that I like pest control, for instance. Like, we hired a pest control company for my new house that I live in. We never did that at my old house. That's now that rental. That's the duplex I was mentioning. I hired them at my current primary, and then I said, hey, well, you know what? Why don't you go check on things at this rental property I own? And can you give me a deal? And they're like, yeah, absolutely. So I'm now getting a better deal on both properties than I would if I would just hired them for one. So there's definitely that economies of scale, I think. And I believe that you can be more persuasive with folks who are providing services for you if you are giving them multiple properties to work on or additional work above and beyond what you would for a single property. So, and I don't know if the manager, if you're hiring a property manager, A is going to be using the same service vendors that you are. They probably have their own connections, just like you've built out your own network. They have their own network. And so if there's no overlap there, it might be difficult to use that same persuasion or to get that similar economies of scale. And you could say, well, I'll use your service provider, property manager, for my primary residence. They might not want to share them. They might keep them so busy that there's not a lot of free time or downtime for them to go deal with the water heater at your owner-occupant primary residence house. So that was a very long-winded way of saying I don't think I've been price gouged, but I do like having those touch points, that kind of personal connection with all the vendors that I work with for both the primary and the owner and the rental property.
Okay, cool. Let's move on to like the entity structure of it. Do you change it? Do you keep it in your name? Do you move it to an LLC or a corporation? What do you do with it?
Yeah, another really good question. So our first condo that we purchased as an owner occupants and then moved out of, I did move that into an LLC. Our second house, I have not since moved it into an LLC. I probably should though, based on this conversation. I think it's probably a good idea. Thank you very much, Pierre. I
One
appreciate
action
that.
item there.
That's it. Hold me accountable too. For the next recordings, ask me if I've done it since. But so totally personal preference. I'm a big believer in entities. I like them. I like a single member LLC. I think it's a very versatile, useful entity structure that's very simple to establish and very simple to operate. So I think it's a great way to go. There's two camps here. There's the pro LLC versus the no LLC. I'm a California investor and California native, California resident. So that means I'm paying a minimum $800 a year just to have the LLC. So the pro LLC people say, well, it's worth it given the protections that it affords. The no LLC people say, man, I could buy enough insurance, $100 a year, and not have the headache of having the entity or any kind of structure. Who's right at the end of the day is only determined once a lawsuit's been filed and has been completed. So I think both camps are valid. But again, it all comes down to personal risk tolerance on what makes sense for you in your personal situation.
And do you bundle properties in an LLC or do you open up one LLC per unit?
Yeah, it's such a good question, man. So I see people online talk about this all the time. Like,
maybe
if you don't have one, yeah, we can totally do an episode about it. But like, people I see all the time, if you don't have one LLC or one property per LLC, you're an idiot. What are you doing? Why would you ever bundle stuff? And I'm like, well, you don't live in California, do you? And they're like, no, I live in Missouri. Why? I'm like, exactly, because it's $800 a year per LLC. And so there are instances where that totally makes sense. But for your average investor that might be having a $2,000 a month or a $2,500 a month rental, $800 a year is a significant portion of your cash flow, likely. Now, if the thing rents for 10 grand a month, you've got a super luxury high-end home and you're making several $1,000s a month in cash flow, well, then $800 a year might not be such a big deal to separate and segregate each property into its own LLC. And for anybody that's living or listening outside of California that owns property outside of California and considering converting it their primary to a rental, this could be you, absolutely, where having an LLC per property might make sense. Maybe you move every year into a new owner-occupant house, or you're house hacking. People talk a lot about that, and then move out of the property, convert it to a rental, and then you leave it behind in an LLC, like this snail with a trail of properties and LLCs in your wake. That could make a ton of sense. But for me as a California investor, that just never made sense from a cash flow perspective. So I was comfortable taking properties, bundling them together, bucketing them together into LLCs, but just carrying enough insurance that I'm not worried about it.
Cool. I have a juicy one now. What are the tax implications of this?
Ooh, that is a juicy one, man. I'm so glad you asked. So, so many. We could probably do an entire episode about this topic just in particular. But basically, the biggest one is going to be your mortgage interest deduction. So as an owner-occupant, you are allowed to deduct the interest on your mortgage up to, I think, and don't quote me, but I think it's $750,000. So if you have a loan size above $750,000, the interest above and beyond that is not going to be a deduction. Now you convert that to a rental property, that rule goes out the window. So you could have a $5 million mortgage. All of that interest that you pay in a given year is going to be a deduction. Secondly, pretty much every dollar you spend owning and operating this property, because it's a rental, is now going to be a deduction. So any repair that you do on the property, any improvement that you do on the property, it might have to be capitalized over a number of years, but those dollars will be deductible at some point in the ownership life cycle of the property. Gas you spend going to and from the store to get your materials, all the material costs. If you go out to dinner with your partner or spouse and are talking about how to manage that property better, that could be a deduction. Like, there are just so many ways to structure deductions against the property that are not at all available to you when living in the property.
And when does this time period start? Like, can you say like, oh, I'm going to turn my I'm going to turn my primary into a rental, and I'm going to live here during the renovation process, which is an investment into, do you have to move out? Like, when does it start?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and it's better for a CPA.
Okay.
I'm just gonna asterisk,
we're not professionals.
Yeah, but I would say that the vast majority of even those renovations is likely going to be a deduction at some point down the road. Now, what might happen is you might look at the repairs or upgrades or dollars spent on a pro rata basis. So if you install a brand new kitchen in, let's say, 2024. And with the intent to convert it to a rental, but you don't move out until December 10th. And so there's 20 days that property could have been a rental. Your CPA might look at that and say, oh, okay, well, you spent $100,000 on the kitchen remodel, but you lived there. And so you only had it as a rental for 20 days. They might look at that and say, there's a small percentage of that renovation that you can claim as an offset against your income. I could be totally wrong about that, but that's how I think they're going to look at it, versus you making it super clear, hey, this renovation is for a tenant. I'm tenant proofing the house. I'm doing all of these things with the intent to move out. There might be a different way to assuage the CPA. And again, this is all best directed to CPAs because they can tell you specifically. And I would say have this conversation before you start doing any of these major renovations and before you move out of the property, because they can help you strategize when and how to make those renovations, or to how best spend those dollars to maximize the tax advantages that you can glean from it.
We should bring in a tax professional to just
Absolutely.
go in great detail of this whole process from the tax
You mean us just like monkeying around trying to figure out,
Yeah, I just wanted to see if you had anything like fresh, experiences that you've been through, the obvious stuff, but it can get pretty hairy pretty quickly.
It can. And there are so many layers to it that, that's one of the reasons I always and will continue to kind of scream from the rooftops that getting a tax professional is well worth it. I know there are a ton of people out there that do their own taxes and have always done their own taxes and intend to continue doing their own taxes. But if you're converting your prime residence to an your prime residence to a rental property, getting a tax professional to help you out might be one of the best decisions you make, because they're likely going to be able to save you more than they cost you.
Yeah, do the math.
It's simple math. Yeah.
Yeah.
The other thing I will mention when it comes to taxes is there might be people listening that have heard of the capital gains exemption for owner occupants, which basically says that if you have lived in your house for 2 out of the last 5 years and you sell it, as a single person, there's $250,000 in tax-free gain that you get. As a married person, it goes to $500,000. So let's say you and your wife, Pierre, were living in your house for the last 2 years. You decide to sell it. There's $500,000 of tax-free gains that you get to walk away with. Now, if you've lived there for less than 2 years, that goes away. So that you got to stay there for 2 out of 5 years. As compared to if you were owning a rental property, you've never lived there, but you own a rental property and you decide to sell it, you're going to be taxed on any capital gain that you make. Now, there's the 1031 exchange, which basically says you get to defer paying those capital gains, but you have to roll all of the profits and all of the proceeds into a new property. So you're not taking any cash out of that deal, out of that sale. You can, but then that gets taxed. So if you're trying to avoid or defer taxes entirely, you roll everything from that 1031 exchange into a new property.
So you anticipated my next question, really, which was like, what do you do when you want to sell this? You're actually in a better position to sell it when you've already converted it into the rental. You're well beyond your 2 years or whatever, and it's already an investment property. You can 1031 that, it's eligible.
Potentially. Well, yes. If it's an investment property, you can 1031 it. But the question becomes, okay, you've lived in the property for 2 years. It's now been a rental for 2 years. And so you're inside that 5-year window and you decide to sell the property. How should you sell it? If you're going to make less than $500,000 and you're married, you're likely going to qualify for that exemption. And so you would want to sell it and take the profits and just do with it what you will.
That's the easiest way. You don't have to rush into
you don't have to worry about any kind of tax basis. Yeah. Versus, hey, maybe you bought really well and you've added a bunch of value to this thing, and now you're going to stand to make $1 million on the sale. Well, okay, now you've got the 1031 exchange available to you. So I think it's a really, really, really powerful way to own rental real estate is converted it from a primary residence. Now, my wife and I, we didn't live in our properties, our 2 past primaries, for 2 years. So we're not eligible for that exemption, the capital gains exemption. So if we decided to sell one of these properties that we've since converted, it would only be via a 1031 exchange, or we would just get taxed on the gain and pay the tax.
So I want to bring it back to the very first question. I don't know if I got exactly the response I was looking for. Like, who does this make sense for? Do you have, like, when you live in a primary, you want to move to a new primary, do you have to have all the cash you need to buy that new primary separate from the sale of your current residence? Or are there ways to get into that new primary without letting go and keeping that rental property? Is it only for like extremely wealthy people who don't need the money?
Have a bunch of money? Yeah. No, exactly. It's such a good question. So I think if anybody is moving out of a primary, they should at least consider converting it to a rental property. And to your point, exactly, and to your question is, okay, well, if I need this, I need the proceeds from the sale of this property in order to get into my next property as my down payment. There are a couple ways and a couple things to consider. First and foremost, depending on what kind of interest rate you have and how much equity you have in the property, could you do a cash out refinance? And so is there cash or equity available in the property for you to take in the form of tax-free cash to then go use as your down payment for the next property? Now, bear in mind that if you're taking cash out of this property, your payment is going to likely change. And so anybody listening to this that bought a property over the last 2 years, they might be exchanging a better rate. They might be exchanging a higher rate loan for a lower rate loan. And so you're kind of getting the best of both worlds. You're getting additional cash and you're getting a better interest rate on your loan. Versus people listening to this that bought during the pandemic, such as myself, I have a 2.875% on a 30-year fixed loan.
Stop bragging about it.
I can't touch that. No, not to brag, but just to articulate the point, right? Is like, I will never touch that loan ever.
Yeah.
Ever. And so refinancing is not an option for me.
That's free money. That's
it basically
negative interest rate.
It basically is, especially that banks are paying 5% like for savings account or money market account. Like I will never touch that loan. We are one of the very fortunate, in a super fortunate position. Now, granted, we bought during the pandemic where property prices were at their all-time highs. So there's that to consider as well. In California, your property taxes are fixed to your purchase price. So yes, we have an extremely favorable interest rate. But did we buy at the top of the market? Maybe.
Yeah.
But in any case, so option 2, if the cash out refinance doesn't make sense for you, is to look at getting a home equity line of credit or a HELOC. And so a home equity line of credit is basically access to equity in your property via a checkbook. And we covered this on a prior episode of what makes more sense. Should I go get a HELOC or should I get a cash out refi? And you can check out that episode by clicking on this link. But if you need cash, getting a HELOC could be a great way to get your down payment for that next property, such so that you can keep the first property, which is what my wife and I ended up doing. We said, you know what, we don't want to give up this amazing rate. We don't want to give up this amazing property that cash flows as a rental property. So let's put a HELOC on it. Let's draw on that HELOC and use that as part of the down payment for the new house. Now, the way that we thought about it is now that old primary, this duplex that we moved out of, has two mortgage payments. We've got the existing mortgage, that 2.875% payment, and we have this HELOC payment. And HELOCs are traditionally interest only, but we opted to make a significant principal payment every single month. And so the rent that we're able to collect for that covers both of those payments and then some additional cash flow as well. And so once we have that HELOC paid off in its entirety, the property will cash flow even better, and we will have been able to purchase our new primary that we're living in now without having to sell that initial primary or that duplex. So I know I said a lot of words there, but is that making sense?
Yep.
There's a bunch of different ways to string this together, to piece it together. And I will say that getting a HELOC on an investment property is often a lot more difficult. And so I'm of the opinion that setting up a HELOC before you move out of your prime residence is one of the best things you can do, even if you never use it. You've got this emergency kind of safety net there should you need quick cash at a moment's notice. Once you get it approved, like there's no approval process. No one's going to scrutinize you and say, oh, Pierre, I saw you took $20,000 out of your HELOC. What is that for? Let me approve it. Let me underwrite it. No, it's your money to do with what you please. You got to be responsible with it because it's now a second loan on the house that could cause you to get foreclosed on if you're not making payments on it. So I wouldn't recommend going and buying a boat with it or buying a TV. But if you're using it responsibly, it can be a very powerful tool in your arsenal. Now, keep in mind, obviously, interest rates can be variable on those, so they can balloon rather quickly. But we use it as a very short-term loan to be able to get into properties. We've also used our HELOC to go and do flips on properties. So there's a number of different ways that they can be used. So all that to say, I think they're very powerful tools. They're very versatile tools. And so if you're thinking about moving out of a primary, converting it to a rental, consider getting a HELOC before you do that, even if you don't need it today. The last thing I'm going to say on taxes is, as an owner-occupant, there's no such thing as depreciation. As a rental property owner, depreciation is your best friend. And so let's just use some quick math here. 27 and a half years is what we get to depreciate for the building value. Let's say you bought a property for $500,000. Let's do some quick math together. Typically 80% as a rule of thumb is the building value, 20% is land. So if we take that $500,000 property that you bought and lived in, the annual depreciation that you would be able to claim is $14,545, excuse me. And so those are dollars that are going to directly offset the income of that property. So let's say you were able to charge $3,000 a month in rental income, which is $36,000 a year. The taxable income is going to be that 36 minus all of the expenses associated with that property, which are your property taxes, your insurance, operating costs, mortgage interest, and depreciation. So half, or nearly $15,000, is going to get wiped away immediately in terms of a paper loss. But remember, that's not dollars that you actually spent on owning this property. This is a gift from the government in the form of a paper loss, which protects the income that property is generating. So if you're not familiar with depreciation, I highly recommend you come check us out at myfiacademy.com. I've got a ton of great curriculum and content about it. But just know, if this is your first introduction to it, it is one of the best ways to protect income that, in my opinion, exists in terms of business, in the business world.
All right, Mike, I have one final stupid question.
No such thing. Tell me.
All right. I'm trying to hack this whole process here.
I love it.
Can we take our primary residence, put it into an LLC, and then rent it back to ourselves and then win-win?
Yeah, the short answer is yes. And so I'm actually in the midst of doing this right now. And so it gets complicated quickly, but at the end of the day, you need to be operating a business out of the property, because then you're paying. Why else would there be rent being paid to yourself? And so you want to make sure that you're getting with a CPA or a tax expert that is going to help you structure this appropriately and legally. But so I'm about to go through this right now. I operate a business out of my home. It's MyFi Academy. And so I am renting a portion of my house from myself. And so that's going to be a write-off and a tax deduction for me. The nuances of how it all works and what those numbers look like, again, that's for you and a CPA to discuss. But the short answer is yes. if you are operating a legitimate business out of your home. You can't just rent from yourself and pay yourself rent and say, oh, well, I'm a renter. And so
what if the
that's a
LLC,
deduction.
you're just like a beneficiary on it, and the LLC is kind of owned by a trust of which you're a beneficiary?
What is the LLC doing? What is its business purpose?
I don't know. I haven't thought that deep about it. I just thought I found the ultimate hack to win, to have the best of both worlds.
No, I think you're totally on the right track. If you've got a business a business case to make for having this LLC pay rent, then I think you're onto something.
No, I'm saying the LLC owns the primary residence, and you are just a tenant paying rent to the LLC, who is the owner of the property.
And I see. I don't think so, because you're the owner. You're the LLC owner.
But what if the LLC is owned by a trust of which you are a beneficiary only?
It's a very good question. If there are any CPAs listening, we would love to hear, can you rent a house that's owned by an LLC, owned by a trust, and have that be a rental property situation? I love it, man. We'll have to get a CPA on and answer that question. I love the way that you're thinking about it.
All right, that was the end of my notes and questions. So.
That was great, man. That was great. Short story long, if you are considering moving out of your home, I would absolutely recommend you at least consider converting your primary residence into a rental property. Look and see what rents are going for in your area. You might be pleasantly surprised. But again, at least you'll be armed with the information to make as an informed decision as possible. And then make sure you're checking all the boxes that we covered on the episode in terms of making changes to utilities, insurance, taxes. Hopefully this was, you learned something. Hopefully this was enjoyable. If nothing else, you got some creative accounting ideas from Pierre to go investigate. We look forward to seeing you on the next one, everybody. Happy investing.
Take care, everyone.